Uh,
All right. So Bruce,
Continue.
we're here to learn about the work that you've been doing through your fellowship through ICE. So looking forward to the presentation and discussion. And be quiet and turn the floor over to you.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you very much for having me, and thank you, folks, for coming. Oh, host has disabled participant screen sharing. I think you have to enable that. And then you're muted also, Chris.
All right, try that again.
Let's try it again. All right, yep. Looks like that's working all right. So there's my screen and there's the presentation. Let's see if I can. Slideshow. I think it automatically dictates. There it is. See, on the bottom of the screen, it's automatically dictating. I don't, that's been happening in my classes, and like, I find it kind of in the way, but I don't really know how to stop it. And if you're already recording this on Zoom, if you're recording in the cloud, it's going to dictate anyway, right? Anyway, okay. Well, anyway, thank you for having me. So this is a multi-year project um, on sanctuary churches and sanctuary schools. And we are in, I think, our third year at least now. We published one piece on this, and I'm very happy to send that publication out. And I'll talk a little bit about what that publication was based on. And now we're in this second phase of the study, which is going out and interviewing folks. So sacred mobilizations, sanctuary churches, and sanctuary schools. And one of the reasons why I say we, of course, well, the reason is because Luis Fernando Macias is my partner, my research partner in this project. And I think all of you know that Luis was a Macy graduate. He's a BGSU alum. And he's just a great guy. And so I was very happy to bring him into this this project. He has a longstanding interest in the rights and concerns of undocumented peoples. He's fully fluent in Spanish. I mean, he's just the right guy to bring in. He's got a good heart too. So I really enjoy working with Luis. Okay, so I'm kind of toggling between what I'm looking at here, and I've got a larger version on my my monitor. So please forgive me if I'm looking up once in a while. It only means that I'm looking up at my notes on my monitor. But let me tell you a bit about what got us interested in this. So when we use the word sanctuary here, we mean specifically the sanctuary movement. And specifically there, we're talking about a sanctuary for vulnerable people, providing a kind of space and other kinds of measures of protection for people who really in this period right now are vulnerable to deportation. They're forced migrants who are vulnerable to deportation. Some of them are voluntary migrants who don't yet have documentation, and so they're also vulnerable to deportation. We have a long standing history, I would say, within the West. It's not only in the US, but really within the West, of providing sanctuary, particularly on the religious side, to vulnerable individuals of varying types. And there's an interesting conversation there about that. But so I'll get into some of that stuff right now. Our main research questions, I don't have it on the slide, but our main research questions are these. So first of all, we want to know the degree to which sanctuary public schools and sanctuary churches resemble one another when it comes to their practices, their sanctuary practices, and also their mobilization of a covenant community to support those practices. And I'll talk a bit about what I mean by covenant community in a bit. And behind that, I'm always interested in, nature of kind of questions, like what's the nature of this phenomenon, or they're ontological questions. And so I'm interested in the ontology of sanctuary, like what is the nature of sanctuary at this particular historical moment in the United States? It's changed over time. What does it look like at this point in time? So I'll talk about that stuff too. So there's these three phases of the study. The first one, which we've pretty much finished and published about, was simply a document analysis, an examination of school and church sanctuary resolutions. So we studied 20 resolutions altogether. In fact, I've got a listing of them here. I'll just share them really quickly. This is from the appendix of our publication. It lists the church resolutions and school resolutions that we looked at. You can see there are 10 on the church side and 10 on the school side there. And we did a inductive thematic analysis of these resolutions. And so part of my presentation today, we'll be just talking about the themes that we found across these resolutions. The second phase of the study will then be is what we're doing right now. And it's what the Institute for the Study of Culture and Society provided my release time for. And I should also mention, I got a building strength grant to support our travel across the country to do this. Is we're interviewing the sponsors of those resolutions that we studied in the first phase of the project. And inevitably, as this stuff goes, once you get out in the field, you start talking to more people than you had planned to talk to originally. And that has definitely been the case now. So we're talking to other leaders within the sanctuary movements. And what this means concretely are principals of schools, primarily high schools, though not exclusively, and then priests or pastors or religious leaders within local churches. The churches that we have been looking at have been all Christian churches. There's a historical reason why that's the case. It's not just that, there are synagogues and mosques that also provide sanctuary, but there's just an overrepresentation, I would say, of the Christian church in various denominations that are providing sanctuary practices. So that's really why we have gravitated in that direction. The next, let's see here, there we go. Short history of the sanctuary. That doesn't really quite make sense. I would say short history of the sanctuary movement. As I mentioned before, the sanctuary tradition has deep roots within, I would say, really Western civilization. I mean, early forms of the medieval church in Europe, England, and also the continent had provided sanctuary for fugitives. And for also like runaway slaves. And it's a very interesting story to tell here. And there's an interesting kind of course, there's a whole kind of like scholastic study of this, just the, sanctuary in the medieval church. But it kind of boils down to a few things. And one thing is that the church would provide a temporary kind of space of protection for people who are still awaiting trial, and even if they were guilty, this is the weird thing. So, say for example, somebody might have well been guilty of murder, but they're fleeing, right, persecution. The church would actually provide them sanctuary for a while, because the church felt as though they had primary jurisdiction over this person's soul. Right, and this person had to atone to the church first if they had any hope at all of at least mitigating, right, their future. Whereas the state really didn't have that kind of like spiritual jurisdiction. So the church was at war with the state over like the destiny of souls, and this is why the church would provide sanctuary. It was like more like, this is our guy right now, and we have primacy. And it represented a kind of a greater and increasing power struggle between church and state, and particularly as Europe entered the pre-modern period. So it's really interesting to me because of the radical transformation that sanctuary began to take on as we entered the modern period. So we could spend the rest of the morning or afternoon talking about church sanctuary in the medieval period, but we'll move on. So there's at least 3 important chapters of the sanctuary movement in the United States in the modern era. Um, One was the sanctuary in the Vietnam War period, and it's an interesting, rather short chapter, but a lot of uh, would-be GIs, right, during the Vietnam War sought sanctuary as basically an act of pacifist resistance, right, in churches. Um, and churches, the more progressive wing of churches would provide a shelter for them as they effectively avoided the draft or avoided active duty as a matter of principle. I think there's a case that I read about in California where authorities actually entered a church and forcibly removed a Vietnam War resistor. So sanctuary is the kind of cultural jurisdiction of sanctuary is not always respected. I'll put it that way. There are definite cases of violation of that cultural space. The second phase of sanctuary, and the one that we kind of actively work from philosophically, is the Central American crisis of the really the late 70s and into the 1980s, when the U.S. was supporting dictatorships in places like Nicaragua and El Salvador. And we were complicit in the forced migration of tens of thousands of refugees from this part of the world. And this is the Reagan Thatcher years. So this is not the most friendly decade to asylum seekers, particularly if they involved seeking asylum from geopolitical conflicts that we were somehow complicit in. And so this really spearheaded a very large iteration of the sanctuary movements amongst progressive churches, including the Catholic Church, which is very interesting because they're rather conservative on these kinds of things, and they're usually closer to the state. But uh, progressive churches, particularly along at first the southern border states like Arizona, where it really started, but then increasingly into the north as sanctuary seekers work their way up into the northern states. I have a kind of personal history behind this because my mother was involved with the Quaker Church, the Quaker Friends Church in Madison, Wisconsin, basically in the 1980s when I was somewhere between middle school and high school. And she used to come home, and tell me, "Now, I don't want you to tell anybody about this, right? I don't want you to tell anybody about what's going on, but here's what's going on." And so I felt like super charged. And now that history is very transparent, and you can read about it. But at the time, it was very clandestine, and progressive churches really they couldn't tell you what they're doing. So the third phase of the third chapter of the sanctuary movement in the U.S. now really is what's been dubbed as the new sanctuary movement. It actually started before Trump. Trump did not help matters much. We'll put it that way, because of his really kind of draconian and hard-lined immigration policy and curtailing of our asylum policy. Just like closing the faucet to a trickle of asylum seekers in the U.S. didn't help. But the new sanctuary movement is focused on largely on undocumented individuals, largely, though not exclusively, from the global South, and particularly Latin America and Mexico. A lot from Latin America, as it turns out, like I'm talking about Central America, South America. But we do have sanctuary seekers, from Afghanistan and other parts of the world too. So it's not only about folks from Latin America. As I mentioned, the focus now is really on staying here in the States, and it's been sort of shifted to life and security in the U.S. as opposed to insecurity abroad. Whereas during the first the Central American crisis, it was basically like fleeing for my livelihood from El Salvador, and I can't go back there without being murdered. So there's a concentration on kind of ending the war abroad to make my life easier. So there's been kind of like a political shift too. What I found, because I knew about sanctuary from an early age, very early age, like 13 years old, I found it so fascinating that secular authorities were beginning to take up a sanctuary identity. Um, Not only public schools, but I think everybody here knows that sanctuary cities, right? Sanctuary municipalities, even in the case of California, like a sanctuary state. Um, so I thought that was just fascinating that what had been historically a a religious a practice really, and something that circulated within faith communities had extended now to the secular realm. And so I thought there's something we could learn from that. So in terms of the analytical frame, um, there are a couple. There's one that I focus on right now, which is this notion of a covenant community. We often associate covenants, I think, with faith communities because it has to do with adherence to a belief doctrine of some kind. But covenant, if you look up the definition, really means just a binding agreement, a formal, solemn binding agreement. And it doesn't, the root definition does not necessarily have, even etymologically, it doesn't have religious roots, although we frame it in religious ways now. A covenant frame we can think of as a kind of symbolic boundary, a sort of paradigm for religious expression. And so I'm interested in the sacredness of communities, whether we're talking about the sacredness of a community supporting a public school, or the sacredness of a community supporting a sanctuary church. And I don't mean, when I use the word sacredness, I don't necessarily mean sacredness with like capital R religion. There's something about this that's sacred and transcendent, and that's part of what drives me in this research. Anyhow, so I'm looking at the covenant communities on both sides, the faith communities, like religious communities, church communities, and public school communities. A bit about our research methods. So I mentioned before, we investigated 10 church resolutions and 10 public school district resolutions on the from the East Coast, from the West Coast, from the Midwest, a bit from the southern states. There are southern states that have sanctuary churches. There's one down in Nashville, for example. And then we tease them out for these themes. And I'll tell you, I'm going to list the themes in a minute, but I can just tell you them right now. One of them was organizational identity. Another one was justification and also legitimation of a sanctuary identity. The third is individual protections, like protection measures for individuals. A fourth theme was non-discriminatory provision of services. In other words, we won't discriminate based on your immigration status. And finally, networks of support, like organizational networks, organizational partnerships. So that's what we found in our church resolution study in terms of thematic analysis. So now we're in the second phase where we're doing interviews. We have not, we're still actively doing this stuff right now. So we're actively transcribing. So we've not gotten to the stage of coding and analysis yet. A third a possible phase of the project, which I really would like to get funded, is to do some kind of case study of a sanctuary school and a sanctuary church within the same city, and do interviews with students and focus groups with students, as well as church members, and sanctuary seekers. That's a whole other layer, as you know, of ethical review, but and probably a much larger grant than what I had for building strength. So anyway, that's the third and hopefully to come phase. So in terms of, I mentioned before, these are the major themes that we delineated from our study of church resolutions. These are themes that cut across both schools and churches. So in other words, these are themes that they share. Identity, legitimation, protection measures, not discriminating, and then networks of support. So I'll just cut right into talking about, I need to make my note screen a little bit bigger here, about our findings so far. So in terms of organizational identity, not surprisingly, from phase one of the project, school districts see the sanctuary subject, in other words, the sanctuary seeker, the sanctuary student, as basically a juridical person, like a person who has rights, right? It's very rights-based thinking. And of course it should be, it's based on federal law, right? I mean, undocumented students have a right to education based on the Plyer versus Doe decision. So they frame their seeker within a kind of secularist, rights-based kind of a paradigm. Churches, interestingly, frame their sanctuary subject as a member of the faith community. That person also has rights, but there's a kind of primacy, a kind of moral primacy that emerges within discussions with churches about how they view sanctuary seekers. A person deserving of protection based on a kind of moral claim, right? So that's not too shocking, too. I'm interested in the overlaps. From so far, and this is like reports from the field, right? Like, so the emerging findings from phase two, you got to picture this as sort of like a moving train here. But what we saw, things that are popping up so far for us, one thing, and we couldn't have really ascertained this from a study of resolutions alone, is the context, the importance of context, like the demographics that are attending a particular congregation, or the demographics that are attending a particular school. For example, there's it's emerging for us a very important difference between the kind of historic ethnic church and the kind of for lack of a better way of putting it, that's a sort of middle class, left-leaning church with very good intentions, but with very few representatives of, of the said population within their congregation. Right. Classic case. I visited a Methodist church in the Chicago South Side that had like 99% of their congregation was Spanish speaking, if not 100%, because I think they did the masses in Spanish. And a good percentage of that congregation was undocumented, which is, I should have been prepared to hear that. But when I heard it, I was like, wow, that's a different world. Versus a Unitarian church in a rather wealthy Milwaukee suburb, which had zero people other than whites. I'll just say it, right? It was a white dominant church, zero immigrants in it, and yet was doing important advocacy work for immigrants. And that's like not unusual to see that, particularly with the Unitarians. Unitarians seem to display this. Of course, they have a progressive tradition, but I saw that pattern a lot. The other thing is that this is going to factor into services they provide, of course, right? Like the church that I visited in Chicago had a COVID vaccination clinic going on downstairs, and they had there was COVID screening going on, and because there's a high rate of infection in their community, and a lot of people weren't vaccinated, and so there's other kinds of services that directly pertain to the demographic. So that bifurcation is important to know about. Schools, depending on the school population, there might be attendant kind of projects that support a sanctuary identity. For example, a Dreamers Club, Dreamers as an acronym, right? So those things will matter. Also, are you visiting a school that's like a newcomer school or not? So does it have as an explicit focus newcomer populations? So there's a lot of contextual and identity matters when it comes to parsing out different kinds of schools that have declared themselves as sanctuary schools. Okay, so let's see. Second finding, the second theme from phase one had to do with justification and legitimation of sanctuary identity. So a synopsis of phase one was basically that the affirmation of the authority of the institution. And part of schools, really the affirmation of the authority to protect personal data. It's really all about that. This is our jurisdiction. This is our personal data. You're going to need a search warrant. You're going to need special permission to access this. You can't, as an ICE, immigration control and enforcement officer, you can't simply walk into a school and demand student records. You certainly can't walk into a school and grab a kid and deport them, right? Or put them in an unmarked van and drive them to, a local immigration building. You just cannot do that legally. And what schools do is just they put their foot down and say, here is the law, and we are going to stand by it. And this is our legal jurisdiction. This is our turf. So that's one important, I think just a reinforcement of something we already knew, but we see that within the resolutions, like declared very forcefully, and reminders about the Plyer versus Doe case and things like this. Another interesting finding, and I don't have time to go through all the findings per theme, but another interesting thing that unified schools and churches was this use of texts, uses of really kind of like transcendental texts. And what I mean by that are texts that appeal to some sort of transcendent authority above and beyond whoever's in particular office at the time. So for example, churches would tap selections from a Book of Common Prayer, right, as a way to undergird their sanctuary practices and their sanctuary identity. So they would basically draw upon, the biblical tradition and passages. In a similar way, schools would reference the Constitution, and they would reference particularly like the 14th Amendment. And we came to realize that they're effectively doing the same thing. Churches were using the Bible and schools were using the Constitution in fundamentally the same way. That was to appeal to a transcendent authority to legitimize their sanctuary identity. And when you do that, that's kind of like a sacred move. That's a move into the ineffable in some ways. And it's culturally, it really provides a kind of like weight, right, to your legitimation when you can appeal to these transcendent texts. So that was interesting for us to discover from the resolution study. From the phase two, we're going deeper into what it exactly means per place to have a sanctuary identity. So keywords that are emerging amongst churches now are like, providing safety, protection, a lot about care, and interestingly, the sanctity of the family. I had one pastor who told me that one of the reasons why we provide sanctuary for sanctuary families, and this is particularly during the Trump era when he was, right, remember he was breaking up families, was that because it violates the sanctity of the family. That was fascinating to hear. You couldn't know that from just a study of resolutions. You had to talk to folks to discover that. So among schools, we find this, when they're talking about sanctuary identity, they talk about the needs of kids, the needs of access to resources among kids, of course, fulfilling a student's federal right to an education. And then also like an identity circulating around policies that specifically decline to cooperate with immigration enforcement. So what we call like kind of an active resistance, right, We're not going to cooperate. We're not going to make it easy for ICE to work with us. So non-cooperation. There's also the whole legacy of resistance, which we've discovering is very important for each institution. What sort of legacy are you, inheriting? I cycle back to this remarkable church in the South Side of Chicago, and I'm purposely not naming the church here for protection of identity, but they had a deep legacy of social justice. It didn't just start with the sanctuary movement. It involved city politics and, electing the first, Black mayor Washington there. So there's the legacy of resistance that institutions inherit find its way into how they claim a sanctuary identity. So that's something else that's kind of emerging in the field. In terms of protection for individuals, synopsis of the first phase, we found that immigration status, unsurprisingly, is the primary focus of protection and measures to basically restrict access to student records and things I've already been talking about. In the second phase, we're seeing that, again, there's this protection measures highly interact with membership demographics. For example, I had this with respect to COVID, when we did the sanctuary resolution study, COVID hadn't really hit yet. Now we're doing our field work and COVID is here, right? And so there's a lot of talk about additional protections that were provided for sanctuary seekers in the period of the pandemic, and additional needs, particularly food assistance and monetary assistance, but also a lot more emotional support and counseling that's needed because of the pandemic, and it's real. So that is an interesting thing to hear. The other thing I just want to point out about the emerging findings from phase 2 with respect to protections is this fact that resolutions are very high level documents in a way. They involve commitments that you may or may not fully be able to realize. So, for example, Chicago Public Schools folded into its sanctuary resolution the elimination of the gang database. Lori Lightfoot didn't do that. Didn't do that. She did not eliminate the gang database, and so that is a resolution within the resolution that never came to fulfillment. So that was an interesting discussion with Chicago public school folks about the breadth, I think the breadth of their sanctuary resolution and what they also tried to do within it. And some of it was just wasn't going to happen. Okay, so then, sorry. Physical sanctuary. I think the key learnings, and I'm going to try to speed up here a little bit because I know leave open some time for discussion. In our resolution examination, we only found 2 churches. Now, admittedly, this is a pretty small sample, right? This is just a taste. We studied 10 on the church side, 10 on the school side, but we only found amongst those 10, only 2 that made any kind of commitment to providing physical sanctuary. They made all sorts of other kinds of sanctuary supportive commitments, but physical sanctuary, that is actually housing an asylum seeker or a undocumented family for a period of time. Only 2 actually wrote that into the resolution. So we had this sort of erroneous assumption that maybe fewer churches are doing this now in the new sanctuary movement. Maybe, well, I know this in part because of the fear of violating our federal laws against harboring. But speaking to the phase 2 findings, it actually turns out there's a lot of churches that are still doing this and that have been doing this throughout the Trump period. It's just that they did not publicly advertise it as such. You got to talk to them, and then you find out, oh, actually, yes, we are providing sanctuary, and there's a lot of churches doing it, but they're not, you're not going to discover that necessarily through the resolution language. The resolution is a public document. So that was very important for us to understand. Now, within that discussion about providing physical sanctuary, though, there's there's some detail. Some churches will only do it for like a 24-hour period. Like they, you know, they're still really afraid of violating harboring laws. Others will do it with perfect transparency, and they'll let everybody know they're doing it. And ICE knows they're doing it, and ICE kind of respects the church grounds and then just waits for an opportunity. Like, for example, for a member of the family that's seeking sanctuary to leave the church parking lot, and then they arrest them. So there's interesting kind of factors going on there. Okay, so I just want to so non-discriminatory provision of services, just moving on here. We found that most schools we studied made very explicit commitments in their resolutions not to deny services to students. You know, they made, again, reference to students, you know, constitutional rights, regardless of their immigration status. We found that schools tended also in the second phase, we're finding that schools tend to provide more wraparound support for undocumented students. Their resolutions, by the way, tended to be longer than church ones, which is interesting. But there's such things as like help in accessing higher education or advocacy for families to enjoy a fuller range of public assistance benefits. You know, very progressive schools are doing that kind of stuff. So that's an interesting finding that we're seeing so far in our interviews. I think that the thing I'll close here on in terms of presentation of data findings so far is that with respect to networks and partnerships, when we were looking at the resolutions, we found that there are resolutions among schools to provide training, for example, for school personnel. And there were some church resolutions that did the same. They built in this kind of like, you know, provide professional development. Although when I got out there and talked to school folks, they said, well, that's sort of uneven and it hasn't been done so effectively, or, you know, there's the follow through is kind of another discussion. Some schools also made resolution commitments to allocating resources to training, which was important to hear. Legal services were also most frequently noted within partnerships. For example, legal advocacy, particularly amongst churches, you know, partnering with a pro bono legal service for example, helping a person seeking asylum, helping them with their asylum claim. Emerging findings from phase 2, we're learning just how important it is to be embedded within a larger network of partnerships, and most of them were. It's very difficult to be a sanctuary institution in isolation. Your identity and your practices are sometimes sort of necessarily dependent upon broader networks that you're connected to. Maybe I'll just tease out one other one here. The importance of being located in a sanctuary city. Yes. So you can see from our table here of the places. I think that, yes, all the schools that we looked at were located in sanctuary cities too. This is kind of like a limiter within the study. But it was important for us because we wanted to understand how these places were parts of larger environments of support. Now, one of the things we'd like to do in the third phase is look at a sanctuary school and a sanctuary church within a non-sanctuary city, because we're also interested in environments of less resources, like resource depletion. So that's something. Let's see here. Now I'm trying to move to the next slide. Oh, okay. So comparing churches and schools. So synopsis of phase 1, I would say that both churches and schools define their sanctuary subject, like the sanctuary seeker, through a claim to their respective jurisdictions. Whether there's a sort of secular framing of the sanctuary subject in the part of public schools, or a pretty religious framing of the sanctuary subject in the church side. Now that gives us some insight into sanctuary identity. Secondly, both churches and schools seem to appeal to these foundational texts as sources of transcendent authority, whether you're talking about a biblical authority on the part of school churches or constitutional authority on the parts of schools. In essence, they're basically, it's the same kind of maneuver. And both of them are engaging with their communities in ways that look like they're working with covenant communities, communities that really believe in the mission of these institutions. And I think that is the case with schools, because we know that not everyone in the US who sends their kids to public schools think that those schools should also be providing services for undocumented children. It's not a given, right? This is a matter of believing in the sanctuary school as such. So there's some covenants to that. In terms of emerging findings from phase 2, further to covenant communities, we're learning that these are not always separate communities. There's often overlap between the church and the school communities, as you might expect, right? A lot of those kids at that school attend the same church and this kind of thing. Some of the overlap is formalized, but a lot of it appears to be informal. And it's interesting, like when I talk to some religious actors, they don't really have a lot of formal partnerships with schools, but there seems to be kind of informal networking going on anyway. Also interesting point of similarity between school principals and church leadership in terms of how there's a kind of a presiding ethic of care between the two, which is not astonishing at all, right? I mean, that's perfectly almost expected. Studying, of course, there's limitations. There's a lot of limitations to studying only 20 resolutions and trying to make any kind of general statement about the the state of sanctuary. This is our window in, right? So there's inherent limitations. You don't really know anything about the community or the context simply through studying resolutions. The phase 2 has helped us understand more about the community and the context, but there's still limitations, and maybe the most obvious one, or the elephant in the room, is that we're not yet actually speaking to sanctuary seekers, sanctuary recipients yet. That comes next. We're doing this sort of very purposefully, moving our way in, building trust, and then we'll go back to those same places and see if we can talk to sanctuary recipients. That is, I expect that to be certainly something to go through full board review with HSRB, and the same thing on Louise's side at Fresno State. So that's going to take some time, but that's it. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Bruce. Really appreciate that.
Sure.
So we'll have a little bit of discussion if that's all right.
Yeah.
I'm curious about a couple of kind of various things. And, first, a kind of an observation that when you talked about the church in Chicago having its COVID clinic and its vaccination clinic, obviously this is a space that is safe, right? For these undocumented folks to feel like I can go here and be safe.
That's right.
To tell my name, to be in a place where I can do that. And it reminded me of like thinking about some of those early AIDS clinics in gay communities where it was a safe space for gay men to go to and be in and start thinking of, like to get tested, and to maybe have a positive result, and to start thinking about what their next course of treatments were. And it was just a kind of an interesting kind of social public health parallel. And as I was thinking about that, and that was just kind of an observation.
That's a great observation. But
I'm curious about, one of the things that I'm curious about is this, and it doesn't necessarily surprise me, but I'd like to hear your thoughts around the fact that, like the sanctuary churches in this new sanctuary movement taking these folks are part of our faith community, right? And so that's how we extend sanctuary to them,
right?
And I think about that history that you gave, as far as like in the medieval church, it was kind of there was only one show in town, right? Like it was the diversity of religion, the diversity of
That's right.
of
No, yes.
denomination and various church,
Yeah.
feels like that becomes an interesting sieve to exist
Yeah.
in the sanctuary space compared to when like there was the one church in the town and
Yeah.
they would be providing sanctuary because that's the only space
That's
that
right.
there was and the
That's
only
it, yeah.
people like so
Yeah.
help me understand how you kind of see like that sieve happening, because there's this other historical thing that it like bugged me. It doesn't bug me. It's like it's just another one of those things, right? Because and I get the fact that we're talking about a Christian, in this Christian
Yeah.
space, but I
Yeah.
also didn't think about like all the nastiness that we did to keep Jews out.
Oh, yeah.
At the onset of the Holocaust, right? Like, so there's
Right.
these other interesting faces. So I'll be quiet. and let
No,
you
no, no, no. Well,
digest.
what's very interesting, and I have, I guess, almost like ambivalent perceptions of this. The, the so the medieval sanctuary church basically oftentimes knew that that person was guilty of a crime, and they wanted them to atone for their sins, right? And then the only place they could really atone for their sins was within the sanctuary of the church. It
Right.
certainly wasn't going to be within a secular trial or whatever, or before they're beheaded. So there's a real difference there, Chris, in the modern era, where the sanctuary seeker is presumed innocent, not guilty. They're fleeing harm. They are not themselves the harm. So there's this kind of flip, right, of the church is providing protection for a person who's innocent or a victim of the state, really, oftentimes. And what I found, why I'm a little bit ambivalent in some ways about this is because the way in which I'm going to use the word sell, although it's the wrong word, but the way in which the church kind of fronts or sells oftentimes its sanctuary identity is appealing to this ancient tradition of sanctuary. But it's like, well, wait a minute. Actually, the ancient tradition of sanctuary is not exactly what's going on now. So you can't. It's complicated to draw upon your medieval practices as a way of justifying or legitimating your present practices. I think a safer route to go is just go back to and quote passages from the Bible. Sure, then it's a matter of interpretation, and we can contextualize it in that way. But to draw upon like historical practices, it gets really complicated. So I don't know if that directly addresses your concern there, but there's a the power of rhetoric is very present here.
I guess I'm curious about, is there, I guess they assume that if it's a Catholic church that's providing sanctuary in an area of Chicago or those kinds of things, that the folks that would seek their assistance are going to be Catholics and they're not going to be Methodists, right? Right. Or Jewish or Muslim or those kinds of things, right? Or Episcopalians or whatever it is, right?
Yes.
And so there's this interesting kind of like, we'll protect ours, but not theirs kinds of thing.
But that's not. I'm
curious
glad.
about as well.
Yes, that's the part of your question I have not yet addressed. Yes, it's basically the diversity question.
Yeah.
And in fact, I think I can't say for all churches, but for many, there's this extension of faith. It's not, you don't have to be a member of this particular denomination or even a member of this particular religious tradition, because we have cases of Christian churches providing sanctuary to Afghanis, right? I mean, or to Muslims or others, but they still see it as a kind of like commitment of faith. And in this way, and maybe I'm phrasing it incorrectly to say that they're a part of the larger faith community, because I can see how that'd be interpreted not the way that I intended, right? But it's kind of a extended protection of care that's fulfilling the mission of the faith community. So they're not, many of the churches
Oh,
are not limited in terms of, we're only going to allow you to seek sanctuary in our church if you're also Unitarian, right?
okay, got it. Right. Like,
Yeah.
well, I didn't expect it from the Unitarians, right?
No.
There were some of those others that I kind of I was kind of curious about.
It'd be kind of contrary to Unitarianism to say that. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. No, so that's interesting, right? Yeah.
Yes.
So it's this idea that we as a community of faith are going to engage in this work because it is aligned with our ideas of faith, but all comers
That's right.
that are in need of this are welcome to seek that from us.
That's right. That's
okay.
Correct. Yeah.
I assume the Methodists are probably evangelizing a little bit in there too, but that's all right.
Well, that's another study, you know. That's
yeah,
another
right.
study. You know, some years back, Hey Young and I did a short study of churches that were sponsoring North Korean defectors in South Korea, where this was kind of part of the social contract, what you just mentioned.
Yeah.
What we found very interesting was that North Koreans were very savvy actors in that theater. And they would sort of provisionally sign on to that contract, so to speak, for the length of time that it was of use to them. So there's kind of like on both sides.
They were trained up in that in North Korea, right?
Yeah, right.
That,
yeah,
like, that's how you survive
like,
in that kind of space.
That's right.
I'll play along with your little social contract game until
Yes.
I can get where I need to be.
That's right. That's right. And yeah. And why would you be shocked? You know. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I have one other, and then I'll be quiet and,
Sure.
and see if there are any other questions out there as well. You mentioned kind of like places where it was the community of sanctuary being fully, and this is again still in the church space. It's not necessarily in the school space. Fully immersed in the membership of the church was fully immersed within the sanctuary community, right? So again, 90% seeking,
That's
undocuments
right.
or those kinds of things, or they were completely void.
Yes.
Right.
That's right.
Well, I'm curious about it, and obviously this may be one of those limitations or scopes of the work at this point, but I'm curious about any examples or spaces where it was otherwise marginalized community providing sanctuary, right? So versus dominant white, privileged, middle class.
Yeah.
For example, Black church, right? Like that would also be saying, okay, this is part of our space, a part of our mission, and we need to be engaged in this. So this is part, like we have this social justice tradition. We should extend it to this undocumented space or those kinds of things. And I don't know if there's any in the study or any that you've heard of or any of those kinds of things.
I do not doubt that they exist. Just that so far in our study has not extended to those progressive churches yet. But that's a fascinating question, Chris, to ask whether historically Black churches are providing sanctuary for undocumented individuals as an extension of their social justice work. And that's a fantastic question. I did discover, it's interesting that the person who I had the most fascinating discussion with in Chicago, a longtime social activist and, on the religious left, her brother, now she's of Mexican ancestry. Her brother was one of the principal actors behind getting Mayor Washington elected. So there's progressive politics in the South Side that certainly overlap, like very, very meaningfully. So that gives me reason to believe that kind of progressivism extends across different racial and ethnic communities.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
All right, I'll be quiet, see if anyone else has any questions.
I wanted to give anybody else an opportunity to, because I know we only have a few minutes, but I do have a quick question. Sorry, there's a baby on my, she's going to participate as well.
I don't know if I can answer that question.
I can't either. I don't know. So I'm wondering if you noticed any, I'm not really sure how to phrase this. So I feel like the word sanctuary city or sanctuary school in kind of the larger political conversation that has been going on over the past, I don't know, 5 or 6 years, has turned into almost a derogatory word that some people use. And just wondering if you saw, you know, if anybody mentioned that in these interviews, or if there was kind of discussion about this, these very different views about, you know, what a sanctuary, whether sanctuary is a positive word or, you know, a derogatory term.
Oh yeah, certainly, but it kind of depended on who I'm talking to. So
Okay.
if I went to a progressive church or progressive school, there's a sense in which you're kind of entering a space where there was a common interpretation of that signifier, right? Everyone sort of had the same kind of reading of that word. And so it wasn't as much as in active circulation. But I've had some pretty interesting interviews with lawyers, with particularly law faculty. One group of really good folks at Albany Law School in New York. Another very good conversation with a lawyer at NYU in their immigration law program, and they're the ones who start talking about rhetoric because most of them are studying sanctuary cities, and Chrissy, that's where your discussion really kind of comes to the fore, right? Because it's been about,
Yeah, absolutely.
debates have been about the identity of a sanctuary city, and then like, you know, it's split the Trumpers versus the anti-Trump, you know, the whole thing, and we should defund these cities. So that's where I think it seems to be within the legal debate and community where that spinning of the rhetoric and the sanctuary as a kind of sliding signifier seems to be most prominent, I would say. So we'll see. I mean, it might be. I think that if we venture off into more contested territory, like you know, the suburbs of Denver rather than Denver proper, or in places like Albany, which are like two cities, and start talking to folks within spaces that are not as kind of like at a macro level as supportive, whether that sliding signifier phenomenon might be more kind of like really relevant.
Yeah, I really like that, this sliding signifier. I don't think I've necessarily heard that term used before, and I think that applies to some things I'm looking at too. I'm gonna have to look into that. I'm thinking even just SEL lately has been, you know, people have been using, you know, basically the conversation is we might need a new name for this, because then it's being kind of weaponized by another group of people who's trying to illegitimize, you know, make it
sure. Sure.
All right. Thank you.
Yes, I would look at Saussure, the semiotic tradition, or Derrida within philosophy.
Great. Thank you so much.
I'm thinking aloud too, because that's
Yeah.
when we go there. Those are the folks I would turn to.
Interesting. Thank you so much. This is really interesting.
Sure. Oh, sure. Happy. Yeah.
Bruce, I guess I think I'm also I'm a little curious about the I know these resolutions that you studied from schools were at a district level and felt like they were kind of being enacted in ways a little bit stronger, maybe at the high schools or those kinds of things. And what are the things, you know, as Judy and I sitting here as folks that study and teach educational leaders, right? In service for educational leaders, what are some of the things? You mentioned some of the care, you know, the theory of care and those kinds of things, but are there other aspects of kind of the language that we might want to be thinking about for school leaders in this space? And even if I'm not in a space that's declared itself sanctuary, right? My board, my superintendent hasn't set a resolution, but if I'm out there, if I'm out in Northwest Ohio and I know that I've got migrant families that are working on various farms around our community, and I'm a high school principal or junior high principal, how am I, you know, what are some of the things that that maybe we should be thinking about helping some of our students be considering in the ways in which they act or behave as leaders in ways that might be helpful for these vulnerable populations that are in our communities, even if we haven't declared ourselves a sanctuary?
I can give you a short answer now, and I'd like to kind of like have some time to work into that question too, to think about it, because I'm not as well versed within the leadership
We
tradition.
can meet up and have some
Yeah.
conversation.
So I don't know what I'm going to say would neatly fit there yet. I would say, Chris, the one thing I've been learning in my discussions with school leaders, and so far we've actually been able to talk to a lot more church folk than school folks. It's kind of harder to break into schools, but the context of the school matters a great deal. Like, I talk to these newcomer schools in like places like Queens. Okay, well, where are you going to find like a more progressive school in the States that's like supportive of immigrants than like in Queens, right? I mean, you're kind of at the heart there. In fact, they're so, just on this note, New York is so amazing. They're so community by community that Queens is like, well, we've got Hondurans and Venezuelans and Nicaraguans here. And if you want to talk about this, talk to the Salvadorians and the folks from Mexico, you got to go down the street to the other newcomer school. I mean, that's how specific and fascinating Queens is. So in those spaces, you've got, the teachers who go to those kinds of schools, they're all on board. Like they're in it 100%. And like the principal that I talked to at one of these places in Queens, she like had sponsored, she had provided foster care personally to 2 undocumented kids for a couple of years. So she brought her into her home, so these folks are living it. And so I think that the kind of like shared vernacular that you can use in a space like that, I imagine might be a little bit different than the sort of shared vernacular that you would use in a school in Lima, right? I mean, I'm just kind of thinking out loud here, but I'm thinking that you just, the way in which you discuss these matters with your teachers, I think is going to have to be contextualized, right? Because if you come across so strong, like you can't be that, I don't know, but necessarily as effectively that principle in Queens as you could in Lima, right? Like you're just not talking, I don't think, to the same folks. So there's a kind of like element of relativism to this, right? I mean, I think you could still be very committed, but maybe just like scale up to emphasis on rights, talking about Plyer v. Doe, talking about the fundamental constitutional rights that kids have, particularly if you're waltzing into a very divisive political space. Does that help?
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. And I would love to have a further conversation about this at some point, right? Because, it is one of those things where in a space like Queens, in a school that is by design for immigrant families, of all documented stripes, if you will, right? That's a different kind of existence than the fact that, again, a principal in Lima still has the responsibility and duty to those non-documented immigrant students that walk through their doors, and that conversation is a different one, but is an important one. And how we help our students think about their moral obligations to every child that walks and every family that comes into their doors, I think is an important thing for us to be thinking about. And I, when I drive home to Indiana, I'm on US 24, right? So in the summer and fall, it's tomato trucks heading to Campbell's, right? Like, if I'm out riding my bike in the countryside, I'm seeing these families that I know are migrant families that are working in these farm fields in this area, right? Like, this is within 50 miles of where we are sitting right now. There migrant camps, migrant families that they're not there now because they've moved with the right, but they're here and they're a part of our school communities, they're a part of our communities, but not in that same way as here's Nicaraguan, Honduran, El Salvadorian, and
right. No,
they're down the street, right? Like it's a different, very different conversation. I think
that's right.
Speaks to a bit of Judy's comment in the chat there as well, right? There's the way in which we think about having to navigate this ideologically diverse space, but still doing the right thing for the students in our communities and schools.
Yeah, I pretty much agree with everything that's being said in the chat so far. I'm going back and forth here, but yeah.
Any other questions or comments for Bruce? All right. Well, Bruce, thank you so much for sharing your work. We really appreciate the opportunity to listen in. And it's not something that we get to, like, I like the fact that Pat prompted us to reboot this bit of work within the unit, because it's nice to hear about what folks are up to. And like, we knew you were out on fellowship last semester.
Just didn't know what the hell I was doing. Right?
What all you were up to, and the fact that it's been going on before that, and it's good to hear. So we really appreciate it, and thank you.
Thank you very much. And I just use this time to say thank you for attending. Thank you also to my partner, Luis Macias in California, who's been really, really helpful with, of course, he's my research partner. And an extended thank you to ICS for allowing us to carry on this work. And thanks to eFlip too. Pat did really pitched in to help me with ICS.
Excellent.
That's
Excellent.
All.
So
all right.
Thanks for sharing, Bruce.
Recording now.
Sure.